Welcome everybody, and I'm also delighted to be here tonight. It's sort of coming to an end of quite a lot of work on the part of Trent University, work that I've done, work that my colleagues have done, work that some of the people that you're going to meet tonight have done, to bring a Fulbright Research Chair to Trent University. And this evening is really about celebrating that, introducing you to our first inaugural chair, and then hearing from the executive director of of Fulbright Canada, who's with us this evening, who's going to talk not just about Fulbright, but really talk in a broader sense about the Canada-US relationship, which is of course what Fulbright itself is predicated on, and that relationship in very complicated times. So I would like to start this evening just by introducing someone who you will hear more from. She has come to visit Trent for the fall semester from Creighton University. She's a historian. She's teaching a wonderful course on comparative Canada-US public memory and public history and on monuments and public memory. That's not quite the precise title of the course, but that's the content. And we are delighted to have her as our first Fulbright chair. And this is Elizabeth Elliott Meisel from Creighton University. And Elizabeth, if you would just stand up for a moment and we could recognize you. And we'll be hearing more from Elizabeth. She'll be speaking, we hope. She'll be we're having a couple of workshops and some in-house events. And I also want to encourage you, if you have an interest in comparative Canada-US history, to drop by Carr House, where Betsy is every day working diligently and being a wonderful colleague. So we're so fortunate to have her. And we will do something in Betsy's honor in a little bit, and that's to be announced at the date and time. I also want to welcome Michael Hawes, the Executive Director of the Canada-US Fulbright Foundation, or Canada, or Fulbright Canada, because then we have to get into the, for Canada-US Fulbright for educational exchanges. God knows when it's going to stop if you get going. So I'd just like to welcome Michael. We've spent some time working on this as well, and we've worked on, I think I figured out today I've known you for 20 years. I realize it's been that long, yeah. Michael's been a wonderful friend to Canadian Studies over the years, a wonderful friend to me and the projects I've worked on, and a wonderful friend to Trent. And I'm really delighted, Michael, that you could come, not just to visit Trent and Betsy and to do the Fulbright thing, but to take your time to talk with us and to share a little bit of wisdom. Michael is also, in his spare time, a professor at Queen's University in political studies. You're not political science there, are you? I told Michael this is going to be informal. I'll introduce you and you correct me. So that's kind of what we're doing. I don't know how you find time for that. And then you have a number of other, but again, we want to hear from Michael. We don't want to need to introduce him for the next 20 minutes. So without further ado, Michael, do you want to come in?
Thank you. So I am, in fact, a professor of political studies. The first step is admitting it. I'm married to a psychologist, speaking of strong, capable women, and always when we travel, I'd remind her not to share that she was a psychologist, or it would be 6 hours of therapy. Now I have to remind myself not to admit to being a political scientist, because I get the same question, but why? What happened? How did we get here? Which is a little bit of what I'm going to talk about tonight. I am indeed a political scientist. I actually, 58 years, I'm going to really date myself now. I wrote my first book on Canadian foreign policy when I was a graduate student in Toronto 38 years ago. And it's still required reading at major universities on doctoral comprehensive exams. So that's something. I'm just doing this build-up so you'll trust what I have to say about Canadian-American relations. Let me start by thanking Michael and Heather for the kind introduction and for inviting me here to Trent on what is an auspicious occasion. First of all, Betsy, our inaugural Fulbright Canada Chair here at Trent. I gather we've just celebrated 58 years of the college and 50 years of the School of Canadian Studies. Heather has pointed out she is a longtime friend and has played a critical leadership role here and elsewhere in Canadian Studies. And in fact, everything I know about Trent is a commitment to not just research, not just scholarship, but to students and to community outreach and to being a welcoming place. So I was thrilled to hear your opening. We at Fulbright Canada also have a big commitment to Indigenous issues, Indigenous studies, and Indigenous persons. We've just founded what we call Honoring Nations Canada, which is a program in combination with, in conjunction with the Harvard Kennedy School, where we're providing opportunities for young Indigenous leaders, where we run a program on good governance. We're putting together a research papers series, and it's entirely Indigenous-led and Indigenous-informed. Our director of the program is a Cree woman from Saulteaux Nation in northern Saskatchewan. Our circle of advisors, 17 of them, include the Inspire CEO, Carol Ann Hilton. If any of you are interested in Indigenous economics, she's written a book called Indigenomics, which was #1 on the Amazon bestseller list for academic stuff, so not really. But again, we have a big commitment in this area, and I appreciated the land recognition and the welcoming. Thank you. Before I talk about Canada-U.S. relations, let me just give because I'm required by law, no, I mean I'm required by my job, to talk a little bit, just for a minute, about Fulbright. Trent has been a big partner for Fulbright, usually on a person-by-person basis. Trent professors have won Fulbright Awards to Duke, University of Washington, Princeton, NYU, Dartmouth College, and others. There is, in my view, sometimes a misnomer about small universities that they're just student-centered, and that just isn't true. The beauty of a place like Trent is it's about research and students. It's about scholarship and students. It's about scholarship and the community. Because if we're going to be impactful at all of these things have to come together. I don't know why it took us 50 years or 58 years to really fully understand this. Maybe the pandemic helped, maybe, but you know, look at the commitment we all have to equity, diversity, inclusion, access, belonging, social connectedness. How did we not get here sooner? But we're in a good place, I think. Fulbright offers awards for students, for colleagues, chairs at 80 different universities, Fulbright Canada chairs. We run programs engaging folks from underrepresented populations. We have this new Honoring Nations program and just do all sorts of things. Our Fulbright address is just fulbright.ca. Easy to find, or just type in Michael. Mr. Jackson's dead and Mr. Jordan no longer plays basketball, so I'm Michael. My apologies. I agonized a little over what to do tonight, given the occasion and the generous allocation of time afforded to me. Every speech I give, I start by saying the same thing. Well, two things. One, I lived in Japan for a long time, and they always confused me with being an American. And I said, listen, it's easy to tell. Americans always start every speech with a joke. Canadians start every speech with an apology. So I'm sorry, no joke. That's it. Secondly, I like to talk about what it is I'm here for. So I'm going to give you the punchline to begin with, and then you can buy it or not. The world is in a very similar place to 1972. So I'm going to talk about 72 and now. And frankly, and I've argued this for many years, we're moving in a direction where regionalism is going to not replace, but, oh God, I hate this word, trump multilateralism. That the geopolitical pressures, the late stages of capitalism, all sorts of factors are pushing us in a direction where, like it or not, good or bad, the America and the Canadian-American relationship is actually more important than it's ever been. And just so we're clear, I'm not an American. I am from Port Royal, Nova Scotia. My family came there in the 1620s, so I'm feeling fairly Canadian. But that's a reality in the world as I see it. I struggled with the title. At some levels, all times are both complex and uncertain. There's that ancient Chinese proverb, we're destined to live in interesting times. People have been dragging that out since the 4th century BC. Apparently all times are interesting. Well, fair enough. I think, though, it's especially so with respect to the relationship between Canada and the United States. And what I decided to do is look at 1972, which was 50 years ago, the School of Canadian Studies, and now. And I guess I'll have to do a little bit of a history lesson in there, but I'll try to keep it at a high level. Bottom line is the relationship is characterized by what I call complex economic interdependence. We are integrated economies, if nothing else. We're probably integrated more culturally than you all think. Anybody know how many border crossings there are in Canada and the US? Well, when we're allowed to cross the border. Guesses? In a year. 400 million. Now I account for a lot of those. But that's more than any European border. In fact, that's more than any border. We're also dependent very heavily on the United States for our security. Back in 1972, and I just came from Inuvik, where there is a DEW line station, distant early warning station. And I was saying to someone this evening, when I was a kid, I lived in Oakville, and NORAD Central Command was in North Bay, and the kill zone was 100 miles, so we were well within the kill zone. My grade 4 teacher, Miss Charrington, would have us practice hiding under the desk. I regularly asked her if that was going to help, and she said, can't hurt. Okay. I agree that it wouldn't hurt. If there was a nuclear weapon, there would be no hurting. But there's social and cultural integration, and there is common space. We used to say we share the longest undefended border in the world. I think we're now supposed to say we share the longest partially defended border in the world. Still a big border. We're also a 3-ocean country, which we forgot for a long time and need to remember, and everybody who does any work in the Arctic knows that that's an important factor. So what I want to do tonight is this. I want to focus mainly on those two periods, 1972 and now, with a particular interest in how external factors shape our foreign policy and our relationship with the United States. There's lots of domestic factors. I'm not going to get into a lot of discussion about which prime ministers didn't like what other prime ministers, although I might mention a few because, you know, it's just too obvious to miss. So, 1972, Pierre Elliott Trudeau narrowly defeats Robert Stanfield in his second election. I think it was 109 seats for the Liberals and 108 for Mr. Stanfield. It was a very narrow victory, and the NDP held the balance of power. Not surprisingly, the majority of Trudeau's seats were from Quebec, which tells us the first lesson we need to know about Canada and Canada-US relationships. To win elections, you need Quebec. To govern in Canada, you need Quebec. To be a Canadian, you need Quebec. It's a reality we can't ignore. When I'm at US universities, they only know one university. McGill. Some of the folks on the West Coast know UBC, occasionally some folks know McGill, occasionally U of T, which I think is ranked 14th in the world or something, so you know, it's hard to miss. Nevertheless, it's McGill. McGill is what they think a university looks like and acts like. A week after Mr. Trudeau was elected, Richard Nixon was elected President of the United States. Not for the first time, but was elected. And again, I won't pick on any recent presidents who claim to have the highest popular vote and electoral college seats in history. At that point, Mr. Nixon did. 49 of the 50 states, a 60% plurality, a sweep of the South. It was extraordinary. Widest popular vote margin in post-war history. A year later, Richard Nixon effectively ended the Bretton Woods system by coming to the post-war economic system, by ending dollar to gold convertibility. And where did he do it? At the Canadian Parliament. It was the every boat rests on its own bottom speech, which was a clear message to us because up until that point, Canada-US relations had been about exemptionalism and exceptionalism. If there was a policy that the United States enacted, we would quietly go down and argue our case with the administration or Congress, and we get an exemption because, you know, we're the friendly neighbor. We are North America's attic. Why would anybody want to hurt us? Nixon's message was very clear. 1972 was a dramatic changing point in Canada-US relations because we were no longer special. We could no longer expect an exemption. We could no longer simply show up and say, well, yeah, that steel thing, those tariffs, that's okay for the Chinese or Polish people or your Latin American colleagues, but we're your friend and neighbor. Not any longer. For me, that's an absolutely key moment in Canada-US relations. And in fact, that whole period for that middle 70s part was critical because the two countries took wildly divergent positions. And I can say this without concern, Mr. Trudeau and Mr. Nixon did not see eye to eye. It was a very, very tense relationship. And America was moving in one direction, and Canada was moving clearly in the other direction. Remember, an NDP government, David Lewis, the NDP leader, basically held the balance of power in 1972 and 1973. So Mr. Trudeau, as an astute political leader, may have co-opted or fell in love with some of Mr. Lewis's policies. 1973 was the creation of the Foreign Investment Review Agency, which was designed to limit foreign ownership of Canadian assets and Canadian companies. He bolstered the Canadian Development Corporation, and a few years later enacted the National Energy Policy, which essentially was an attempt to nationalize the energy industry. The truth of the matter is, in the 70s, Canada was going in a fairly left-of-center direction, and the United States was going in the opposite direction. In fact, and this is the history lesson part, in fact, in 1972, then Secretary of State for External Affairs Mitchell Sharp released a little pamphlet and then 6 little pamphlets called the Third Option Strategy, and the 6 pamphlets were called Foreign Policy for Canadians. The third option was really simple. He said, look, the United States defines who we are, how we act, what we sell, to whom we sell it, and our security. He said, we have 3 choices here. We can ignore them and ignore the question. That's option 1. Or we could engage more directly with the United States. That's option 2. Or we could pursue what he called a third option, and that third option was to look for other partners, to reduce our vulnerability on the United States. At that point, 78% of everything we made in this country was sold in the United States. Our security depended on the United States, and the influence of American culture was, and is, dramatic. Fans of polka dot door aside, It was a very popular 1970s Canadian TV show. Ridiculous, but we'll leave that alone. Sharp's position was really simple. We need to be distinct from, but in harmony with, the United States. Simple message. Here's the problem. How many geographers in the room? There's that geography thing about selling products to markets that you know are next door.
500 miles.
Yeah. In 10 years, our level of integration with the United States increased. It did not decrease. And it increased for a number of reasons. Part of it was geography, but part of it was those markets in Northeast and South Asia were not yet developed. The Europeans were in the midst of a fairly inward-looking expansion of what is the European community. And the truth of the matter is there weren't takers for that role. So in the end, that strategy failed. But interestingly, it did prove to be a contributing factor in Mr. Trudeau's political resurrection. He went 2 years later to a majority government. And what happened to Mr. Nixon 2 years later? Yeah. So that was Watergate, and that was the end of Mr. Nixon. But we've always got to remember that the United States is a society founded on revolution, that they are about individualism, that the United States Constitution guarantees everybody, Betsy, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. My life, my liberty, my happiness. What does the Canadian Constitution guarantee you, folks?
Peace, order, and good government.
You bet. Very communitarian values. And so as the United States moved closer and closer to a deeper understanding of atomistic individualism, we moved away from it. Anybody know who Tom Wolfe is? Bonfires of the Vanity Guy. He wrote a famous piece in the 70s called The Me Decade and the Great Awakening. Any Americans in the room? Okay, good. As if America in the 1970s needed to be reminded about me. There was a very strong movement in that direction. I'm not even suggesting it's bad. It's just different. And it shaped the nature of the relationship. The bottom line is the country's foreign policy typically reflects deeply held national preferences, both philosophical and ideological, while at the same time remaining sensitive to goals, ambitions, and priorities that people have. It's driven in the end by an understanding of national interest. What we often mistake that for, though, is money or political goals or political outcomes. What we often forget is its values, that those national interests can be defined by values. When I was a graduate student, I had a professor named Peyton Lyon. His brother was the premier of Manitoba at the time, and Peyton had just come off a stint as our ambassador to Germany, West Germany at the time. And he would argue that foreign policy is essentially driven by the habits of mind of the people in the country that has that foreign policy. Yes, national interest, yes, security interest, yes, economic interest, but none of them matter if you don't have those collection of values. And again, it shaped that Canadian-American relationship. And yes, I get it, I'm a political scientist, I get previous practices, I get legal things, I get external factors way outside of what we're talking about today. Nevertheless, that shaped, in my view, the relationship. So what happened? How did we get from moving so far apart to, in the early 90s, coming together and agreeing to a fairly high level of integration through the North American Free Trade Agreement? And there's no reason any of you need to remember this, but it actually started in 1984 with a sectoral free trade agreement, just like the way the European Union started over the European coal and steel community. It was about, anybody know what it was about? the auto industry. It was all about the automobile industry. So we had a sectoral deal called the Auto Pact, and then Mr. Lumley, I think, was the Minister of Industry at the time, and this is important because he owned the pop shop, and a guy named William Brock III, one of the heirs to the M&M candy fortune, was the U.S. trade representative. So they had sugar in common. They were just fantastic buddies, and they managed to convince the two governments that we needed a full free trade agreement. And if any of you remember, there was a very vigorous debate in this country about whether that was a good thing. It would put us in an awkward position economically. There was no argument to be made that this, in fact, really would be beneficial, and potentially we'd be swamped by American culture, that we wouldn't be able to withstand or maintain our cultural integrity. All of those turned out to be incorrect. It did provide me with a nice opportunity, though, because I spent almost a year as a young scholar working on the MacDonald Commission with my colleagues Richard Simeon and Keith Banting, and we would travel around and do our little dog and pony show, and the Economist would say how great this was, and Mr. Simeon, who was a Federalist, would say, well, think of the children, we got to be careful. And I would say, let's see. And we did see. And I think that trade agreement, but also the end of the 70s, brought us back together. And the reason it brought us back together is because I think we had common purposes, common security purposes, common economic purposes, and we were finally away from that fear that our culture would somehow be subsumed by American culture, or that our political integrity would be subsumed. I'm sure lots of you have studied the history of Europe. Same fears from a lot of places. Remember, the Brits would not accept the euro, I think still, well, even more so still. And lots of concerns there. But the truth of the matter is, in the early part of the century, we have a different leadership in the United States. You move to the left with William Jefferson Clinton, and then with Mr. Obama, little interregnum there with Mr. Bush. But even then, he was a more practical and less ideological on broad issues than some other Republicans. And if the microphone wasn't on, I would say he looks good now. In comparison. And then two dramatic things happened, and then a whole lot of other dramatic things happened. First of all, Justin Trudeau was elected in 2015. And again, I'm sticking with my values argument. He was elected because he told Canadians that he believed in the values that they believed in. Constructive internationalism, national identity, national priorities. That those were his values, those were our values. And clearly, they bought them. Now, I get it. There's voter fatigue. Mr. Harper been there for a while. I get all of that. But I remember distinctly covering that election and distinctly being impressed by how crafty he was with respect to making that argument, which he believed in, which makes it easier to make that argument. But it was important. And for a short time there, it was a relationship made in heaven. Mr. Obama and Mr. Trudeau were fast friends. I don't know, all the, observations about just how close and how aligned they were on personal, political, and social issues. And then that second big thing happened, which was the election in the United States. And if you'll remember, and I'm not going to talk about all the things, only the ones that matter to Canada, remember when he first appeared down that escalator and said that what's wrong with America is foreigners. He'd pick different foreigners, but surprisingly, one of his main targets was Canada, because he believed that trade agreements hurt American businesses and hurt American consumers. My area of expertise is actually international political economy with a focus on foreign policy. I can tell you that there may be problems with trade agreements, but hurting consumers is not one of them. You close the borders, the price of a t-shirt at Walmart goes from $8 to $20. It's just that simple. So we get a new president who tells us on day one, literally the first day in power, that he's going to cancel the TPP, which he did, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, that trade agreement with Asian partners, and he's going to cancel NAFTA. Now for us, I don't know if I can be any more dramatic. This is an existential crisis. Literally an existential crisis. We were still, I mean, our trade dependence dropped dramatically from 78 down to, 74. The reality is we can't live the life we live, have the economy we have the government and the social services that we have without a market of more than 37 million people. It's just really that simple. And he literally threatened, and at first, many of us during the campaign said, well, he's telling people what they want to hear, which was true. But then we discovered that he was actually serious about this, and that part of his strategy in office would be to make America great again, an expression I think he borrowed from Ronald Reagan. But the question is, how do you do that? And the answer was by basically closing off the borders and bringing all the jobs home and doing all those things that are part of that. So, bottom line, for about 3.5 years, Canadian foreign policy literally went into crisis. In Ottawa, everybody in town was only interested in one brief. How do you get past this existential threat? And at first there was no real hope, because the administration simply said no, they wouldn't negotiate. Then they did appoint a negotiator and they started negotiating, and eventually we got, interestingly, something that looked very much like the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. We got an agreement which is called, if you're in America, it's called the USMCA, which sounds like something to do with the Marines, or maybe the Village People, I don't know, one of those. The US-Canada-Mexico Free Trade Agreement. But it literally changed everything, from a strong, peaceful relationship with irritants, with issues, to a relationship in crisis. And to make it worse, there was a lot of hostility on both sides. There just was. When Mr. Biden was elected, one of his promises was to repair relationships with friends and allies. And on February, I think the 13th, a little over a year ago, the Prime Minister and the President met, and they released something called a roadmap for a renewed partnership between Canada and the United States. Now, no one produces a roadmap to renew a partnership if the partnership's not broken. So clearly the message was there. But the interesting part, and this is part of my argument, it begins with the assumption that you have to fix it. And it follows on that our values turn out to be closer than we think. So what happens is you've got a series of declarations battling COVID, climate change, equity, diversity, inclusion, economic partnership, security and defense. Well, those are all the issues. But you've got a document that says we actually believe that the same path forward is the one we're going to follow. So what we see then is a situation where we're back to a place where we seem to be heading in the same direction. There seems to be a commitment. There's less hostility, certainly in this country, to the idea of a stronger partnership. But, and here's where we get to the complex and uncertain times again. We can talk about all this, but China, the Ukraine, Mr. Putin, populism, the movement towards right-wing politics, whether you're in Italy or Hungary or the United States or Sweden. Sweden, really? Challenges to democratic institutions around the world, challenges to democracy itself. This sounds like a list from 1972. And more concerningly, it sounds like a geopolitical nightmare. And to make it worse, the United States is undergoing some reasonably dramatic internal issues. Political polarization, Trumpism, and I use that term to describe a group of persons who are fearful of external influence in the United States, not the person. But it's serious. I mean, QAnon is a serious threat to democracy and democratic institutions. Persons who argue that elections that are held fairly and freely are not so. Or persons who simply make decisions because they're fearful of others is not healthy. And it's certainly not democratic. And as we've seen, there are also issues about personal safety and others that Americans are very concerned about. All Americans, I think. But there's some need to get that under control. So we live in a world now, and believe me, this is not unique to the United States, but it is particularly challenging in the United States. But, you know, I was saying earlier, our building in Ottawa is right by the Parliament buildings, and when the Freedom Convoy was there, they were literally at the steps of my building. I didn't personally feel very threatened because they had bouncy castles and hot tubs. Literally. And they all looked like refugees from a ZZ Top concert, so that was also not threatening. But it's interesting, their argument was freedom. They wanted more freedom, except what they were doing was taking away other people's freedom. My employees were afraid to come to work. People in the downtown core couldn't live their lives. That's not freedom, but what it reminded me is there's this political polarization where what something is to one person isn't the same thing to another person. So I think we're at a moment where the relationship is stronger. It has to be stronger, but there's a lot of challenges, whether they're geopolitical or domestic or about political polarization or about what we know and believe to be the truth and about what our values are. So in the end, I think we need a stronger relationship with the United States because we do indeed share a continent. We share airspace. We share values. At our very core, our democratic values, so too are they in the United States. But there's a lot of challenges now. So I'm going to end up where I started. I think we're moving back to a more regional kind of world. And I think for us that means we need to be very careful about a relationship that is in fact existential for us, and that we need to understand that. But we also need to be sensitive to, committed to, and understand what our values are. And at the end of the day, we have to let that be our guide. And with that, I'll stop.